2 hours ago, the White House issued a formal diplomatic communication to the governments of the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the European Union, notifying them that the United States was invoking an unprecedented procedural mechanism to suspend Canada's participation in the G7 framework, citing Canada's systematic non-cooperation with American economic policy objectives as incompatible with the alliance's requirement for coordinated economic governance. The United States, as the host of the next G7 summit, claimed the authority to set the agenda and the participant list. The move was designed to isolate Canada at the highest table of Western economic coordination, to strip Ottawa of the platform, the legitimacy, and the allied standing that comes with G7 membership. Washington calculated that being removed from the room where the world's largest democracy set economic policy would force Carney to choose between his confrontation with America and Canada's position in the Western institutional order. You cannot fight the United States and sit at its table simultaneously. That was the logic. Give Canada the choice, and Canada would choose the table. The directive has 3 components. First, the United States is formally proposing a suspension of Canada's G7 participation for a minimum of 2 summit cycles, effectively 2 years, pending Canada's return to what the White House describes as constructive bilateral engagement. Second, Washington is requesting that the remaining 6 G7 members endorse the suspension through a consensus procedure, which would make it a collective decision rather than a unilateral American one. Third, the U.S. is proposing that Canada's G7 seat be temporarily filled by an observer nation of America's choosing, a provision that has no precedent in the alliance's 50-year history and no legal basis in any G7 founding document, because no such documents exist. The G7 has no charter, it has no secretariat, it has no enforcement mechanism. It is an annual gathering of leaders held together by nothing except the mutual agreement to keep gathering. Washington's name for this strategy, empty chair. Remove Canada from the room and the chair stays empty as a visible symbol of isolation, pressuring Ottawa to negotiate its way back in on American terms. The strategy rested on a single assumption, that the other 5 G7 members plus the EU would go along with it. That assumption was wrong within 40 minutes. The responses from London, Paris, Berlin, Rome, and Tokyo arrived before the American diplomatic communication had been formally acknowledged. Not after deliberation, before. Because Carney had called each of those capitals in the preceding 72 hours and told them exactly what was coming. He had asked one question of each. If Washington attempts to remove Canada from the G7, will you endorse it? Every single one said no. 44 minutes after the American communication was transmitted, Canada's foreign minister appeared at a joint press conference in Ottawa with the British Foreign Secretary, the French Foreign Minister, and the German Foreign Minister, 3 of the 5 G7 members Washington needed to build a consensus, all present in person, all having flown to Ottawa in the preceding 24 hours. The visual was the answer before a word was spoken. Canada's foreign minister opened with one sentence. The G7 has 7 members today. It will have 7 members tomorrow. The question that emerged this morning is not whether Canada belongs in the room. The question is whether the nation that called this meeting understood what the room is. Then came 4 moves that dismantled empty chair before it could be assembled. The first move? The UK, France, and Germany issued a joint statement, already drafted, already cleared through their respective foreign ministries, declaring that any modification to G7 membership requires unanimous consent of all 7 members, and that their consent would not be given for any suspension of any member under any circumstances. The statement cited no legal authority because none is needed. The G7 operates on consensus. Canada is a member. Canada does not consent to its own suspension. The suspension cannot happen. The legal analysis takes 4 seconds. Washington's entire strategy collapsed on the arithmetic of consensus before lunch. But this is where the response becomes something more significant than a procedural block. The second move, Canada proposed, and the UK, France, Germany, Italy, and Japan immediately endorsed, A reform of G7 operating procedures establishing that no member nation can be suspended, excluded, or have its participation modified without unanimous consent, and that any attempt to do so constitutes a breach of the alliance's foundational operating principle. The reform does not change how the G7 works. It writes down, for the first time in 50 years, something that was always true but never documented. Canada is not just blocking its own removal. It is closing the procedural gap that Washington tried to exploit permanently for every future member against every future pressure. The third move was the one that converted a diplomatic rebuff into a structural realignment. Canada proposed an emergency G7 session without the United States. Not a replacement G7, not an alternative alliance. A working session of the 6 non-American G7 members plus the EU to address what the formal agenda described as coordination of allied economic policy in conditions of bilateral instability. The session was held via secure video link 2 hours after the joint press conference. Its agenda included 3 items: coordinated response to American unilateral tariff actions, bilateral investment protection frameworks between the 6 members, and a joint statement on the principle of allied economic sovereignty. All 3 items passed. All 6 members signed. The United States was absent. The G7 met without America and produced a document that the remaining 6 members of the G7 endorsed. A document that was immediately transmitted to the WTO, the IMF, and the UN Secretary-General. A document that exists now in the institutional record of the alliance that America built, showing that it met, deliberated, and acted while America tried to manage the guest list. The fourth move was the one that Washington had not seen coming because it required Carney to think not about Canada's position in the G7, but about the G7's position in the world. Canada proposed, and all 5 other members plus the EU endorsed immediately, a formal invitation to Australia, South Korea, and India to join an expanded allied economic coordination framework operating alongside the G7, not replacing it, running parallel to it. A G7+ mechanism that includes the 3 largest democratic economies outside the current membership. A mechanism that, at full participation, represents a larger share of global GDP than the G7 itself. A mechanism that the United States is currently not in because it spent the morning trying to remove Canada. Mark Carney appeared briefly at the end of the joint press conference. He did not give a speech. He answered one question from a reporter who asked whether Canada was concerned about being isolated from the G7. He paused for 3 seconds. The G7 met today. Canada was there. 5 of our partners flew to Ottawa to stand beside us. The 6th joined by video from Tokyo. The institution that Washington claimed the authority to exclude us from just convened without Washington's participation and produced a joint document. I am not sure isolation is the right word for what happened today, but I am open to other suggestions. He walked off the podium. Washington's reaction arrived in stages, each one more damaging than the last to the administration's position. The State Department issued a statement describing Canada's emergency session as unnecessary and counterproductive. The statement was 4 sentences. None of them addressed the fact that the session had happened, that 6 members had participated, or that a joint document existed. The National Security Advisor told reporters that the United States remained committed to the G7 framework. The reporters noted that the G7 framework had just met without the United States. American think tanks and foreign policy institutions responded with unusual speed and unusual directness. The Council on Foreign Relations published an emergency analysis within 3 hours describing the day as the most significant self-inflicted damage to American multilateral leadership since the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. The Brookings Institution published a separate analysis noting that the G7+ framework Canada had proposed, adding Australia, South Korea, and India, represents a coalition whose combined economic weight exceeds America's ability to manage unilaterally. Former secretaries of state from both parties issued statements expressing concern. Former national security advisors who have not spoken publicly about current policy in years issued statements. The market reaction was precise and informative. American assets that derive their value from the assumption of American multilateral leadership, Treasury bonds, dollar-denominated reserve instruments, American multinationals with significant allied market exposure, all repriced modestly downward. Not catastrophically. Modestly. In markets, modest and directional is sometimes more significant than dramatic because dramatic can reverse. Modest and directional is a reassessment. Allied reaction was unanimous and immediate because Carney had spent 72 hours making sure it would be. The British Foreign Secretary described the day as a reaffirmation of the G7's commitment to inclusive multilateral cooperation. The French Foreign Minister described it as a demonstration that the alliance's institutions belong to all their members, not to any single one. The German Foreign Minister said nothing publicly. He had already said everything necessary by getting on a plane to Ottawa. Trump has three paths. Maintain the position that Canada should be suspended and watch the six-member document circulate through every international institution while the G7+ framework adds members and the procedural reform closes the mechanism Washington tried to use. The suspension did not happen. It cannot happen. The attempt to make it happen is now documented in diplomatic history as the moment America tried to expel an ally from an institution and the other allies flew to that ally's capital. Attend the next G7 summit, where Canada will be present, the joint six-member document will be in the record, and the procedural reform will be on the formal agenda. Attend as the nation that tried to empty the chair and found the chair occupied by an ally flanked by 5 partners who came in person. Escalate, and provide the G7+ framework with the justification to formalize, charter, and institutionalize, converting a coordination mechanism into a standing alliance with Canada at its center and the United States negotiating for re-entry. 2 hours ago, Washington tried to empty Canada's chair at the most powerful table in Western economic governance. 2 hours later, 6 nations flew to Ottawa. A joint document exists in the institutional record, a procedural reform has been endorsed, and a G7+ framework, including Australia, South Korea, and India, has been proposed and immediately endorsed by every member present. The chair is not empty. It never was. And the table just got bigger.